Welcome to the Practical Compassion Podcast. I want to thank you for joining the ongoing conversation on how we can make compassion a foundational operating system of healthcare. Through interviews with experts, we help clinicians and leaders and the organizations they serve understand what compassion makes possible and how to build the conditions to sustain it. The goal is simple: a better lived experience for everyone inside healthcare. And this includes patients, the people who love them, and the clinicians who work hard to provide them care. I'm your host, Dr. Russ Lomdieu, DPT. Now, before I introduce today's guest, I want to take a moment to define compassionate leadership because the whole episode hangs on the concept. Compassionate leadership is the cultivated capacity of a person in informal or formal authority to do four things in sequence. Number one, to notice suffering and an unmet need among the people they influence. Two, to interpret what they notice generously rather than punitively. Three, to hold that response to the suffering without absorbing it, causing their own depletion. And four, to take action that reduces suffering and builds the structural conditions under which other people can flourish. Now, notice this is a process definition rather than a personality trait. It doesn't necessarily describe the person, it describes a practice. Notice, interpret generously, hold without absorbing, and act. I read a book recently that talks about all of these things, and the author is our guest today. Captain John J.C. Carter served more than 20 years in the United States Navy with 3 commands at sea, including the rescue salvage ship, the USS Salvor, the guided missile destroyer, the USS Roosevelt, and the amphibious assault ship, the USS Bataan. He carried responsibility for the safety, training, and welfare of thousands of sailors and Marines in operating environments where there was a zero margin of error, and the cost of failure was measured in lives and missions. And by the way, he's also no stranger to healthcare. The Bataan carries a fully equipped hospital with operating rooms, intensive care units, and the trauma capability to handle the worst possible conditions. And that means that he is used to healthcare delivery in a high-pressure environment. And this is something he's done firsthand. Now, since retiring from the Navy, he's worked with corporate leaders, executive teams, and organizations across all industries to translate the lessons of naval command into the work of leading business. His book, The Loudest Sound is Silence, distills 30 years of leadership practice into 13 principles. Each principle is paired with a true story, reflection questions, and a call to action. It is a book designed to be used, not just read. So I want to start by saying, Captain Carter, I loved this book, and I love this book for very, very specific reasons. First of all, it's very readable. I can pick this up and read one of your chapters or lessons in a sitting, a very brief sitting. And I love the way it was organized. I love the fact that you start out with, like, this is the lesson we're going to talk about. Hey, why don't you reflect on these things? And then I hear this great story. And then I get some real actionables afterwards. And every single lesson has some relevance to my experience in healthcare. So I just wanted to say congratulations on what a fantastic book. And I look forward to this getting in the hands of some healthcare leaders because, frankly, they can use some of this stuff.
Well, thank you very much, Russ. And I really appreciate it. And I really wanted to take the book from okay, this is kind of how my life experiences played out and in what may be viewed as sort of the military construct and how that really translated and how I saw it translate when I moved into the corporate world. And then just some quick takeaways for people to, once again, be able to apply them in their daily lives. You know, how do I use what I've learned and how can I, sort of step off and make a small change, to make myself better moving forward.
Sure. You mentioned something just now about your experience in the military and then your experience in corporate world. And I was really intrigued. I've hung around a lot of military people. I spent a lot of time working for the VA, and it's kind of hard not to hang around with former military. If you work at the VA, it's sort of an occupational benefit.
Yeah.
But the military and corporate world are different in ways that a lot of people don't fully appreciate.
Yeah, it's a great point. And a lot of times I think people view the military perspective as being this sort of very rigid, hierarchical, and you know what, you can just simply tell people to go do something and they're going to do it, that there isn't a lot of, energy, or there's not a lot of, process in leading in the military. And what I really found is sort of absolutely eye-opening is a lot of those things that I thought were just, sort of going to be ingrained in corporate culture were almost some of the opposites of that I thought, were in, sort of the military culture. One of the things you talked about is trust, in the military culture, when you arrive at a new station or a new job or whatever, you come in there and often, your rank or your structure already provides that level of trust. Essentially, people will already trust you. It's for you to lose.
Okay.
Which is very interesting. My experience in the corporate world was almost exactly opposite. You had to spend a lot of time building the trust. You have to get along before you go along.
Yeah.
It was really my experience in the corporate world. The other part of it is, because I guess there's this sort of innate trust, I always felt that we were way more open to saying, hey, this happened, or this didn't go well, or hey, I may have blew this call. And where in the corporate world, I felt people were way less apt to admit failure or admit a mistake, for whatever reason.
Well, because they don't want to be perceived as being incompetent and therefore losing some of that trust they're trying so hard to gain. So what you're saying is you're already standing on top of this mountain of trust. You have a little bit more safety, so to speak, to say, hey, this didn't go the way I had hoped. I kind of messed up. Let's reset and see what we can learn from this.
And what's really amazing from that is I think that then reinforces trust, right?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
When people who work for you say, hey, you know what, if I did something wrong, or I'm going to admit it, straight up. And I feel like, hey, nobody, as the leader and holding yourself accountable, nobody is ever going to be as accountable as the person who's in charge, right? Used to joke, hey, nobody's boots are going to be shinier, nobody's going to be more vulnerable, nobody's going to have a better haircut, all those things, you lead the example, and so much from that psychological safety perspective.
Yeah. I talked earlier in our private conversations about the Emmy Edmonton's work in safe cultures of safety. And what she found in her original research, this was actually her graduate research, she found that high-performing teams in hospitals have higher error rates than low-performing teams in hospitals, which initially confused her because there's a real paradox there, right? Like, wait a minute, this is a high-performing team. How do they have so many errors? And what she parsed out over the next few years is that it had everything to do with error reporting. So these high-performing teams were more likely to report an error if it happened, and then with that information, actually learn a lesson that can be learned and become, wait for it, a high-performing team. So what you described to me was sort of this baked-in high-performance structure where you felt comfortable enough to say, well, I screwed up, let's see what we can learn from this. Whereas in the hospital setting where everybody's so concerned about their earned status, right? They're so concerned that somebody might find them out as an imposter or, whatever, that they're less likely to actually admit those foibles. So I think that's a really interesting observation. And through the whole book, I have to be honest with you, the way you talk about leadership in the military isn't really what I perceived it to be. Like, I remember my dad talking about the captain of the ship because he was a seagoing Marine. He spoke very fondly of the man, but I don't ever remember him saying, yeah, and there was that time where he said, yeah, I screwed up. Like, I don't remember that. So I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, so I was transiting from Norfolk up to New York City, and I had the pleasure of having some heads of industry on board for the ride. It was like a 2-day ride. And we had gone through evolution, and we had been part of our daily routine was at the end of the day, prior to the next day's evolution, we would brief what we did that day and what went well, what didn't go well. And every time we had an evolution, I think this was the, coming out of port, we started briefing it, and I would be the first person to get there and say, well, here's what happened. This is what I did wrong. And everybody else would be saying, well, hey, this is what we did wrong. This is what we're going to do better. Let's make sure we capture that. And one of the folks that left there wrote this long article for their company saying that I had been on board here, and the openness at which they shared, the positives and negatives of every event and the learning and capturing that was so refreshing. And he implored his company to kind of take a look at that model.
Right.
And
like it was a new idea.
That continuous improvement. But, unless people feel safe in their environment to communicate like that, it's really hard to kind of create that, level of continuous improvement.
Yeah, no, so there's a direct link between a culture of safety and that sort of Kaizen Toyota manufacturing concept, which stands for continuous improvement, which is what I'm hearing is happening. And there's no place more appropriate for that than a warship. I don't think people realize the level of difficulty it takes to move a thing that size from close quarters to open waters to close quarters. Like I don't think people really appreciate it. And I've moved a lot of big boats. I don't think I've moved boats quite as big as you have. So it's pretty complex, right?
Oh, it most certainly is. And what always happens, I don't know, always happens, but one of those things that I'm always really sensitive to is that one, you have a lot of experience, and two, these issues are really complex, and so you dive deep into both your experience and the details, and it's always those simple things that those things that are just different from the way you planned it, that because you're caught up in the problem set, sometimes it's those people that maybe don't have the details as much, but have this perspective that, hey, that just doesn't look right.
Right.
And then the ability to just come out and speak it,
Well, you tell a story in the book about that. Like there was a junior officer who was like, Captain, I don't think so. And you took a step back and you didn't take that posture of, look, kid, I've been doing this for 2.5 decades since you were in diapers. You didn't do that. You actually kind of saved the ship, if I remember correctly from the story.
Yeah, so we were heading out of port. We were drifting off course, and as everybody knows, whenever it comes to navigation, it's not about where you sit; it's about
where you're going.
and where we were sitting at that time, we were fair, but where we were going, based on our set, we were going foul.
Yeah.
And,
now, just to be clear, for those who aren't nautically inclined, we were going foul means they were going to run aground. And I'm going to tell you right now, that would have made the news in a big kind of way, and that would have been an expensive mistake.
And often you're in foreign ports. Things just the way you kind of visualize them may not be the same.
Sure.
And he and he was the assistant navigator, and he spoke up and said, "Hey, I don't feel good about this," and it really gave me a pause. And
how many grades below you was this? How many grades below you was this navigator?
He was probably 5, or he's probably an ensign or a JG, and I was a Navy captain at the time.
So 5 grades below you, at least. How? I just want to recognize how much that speaks to the quality of the leadership when in a high-stakes situation, someone 5 grades below you feels comfortable enough to say, hey, Cap, we got a problem here. You're not seeing this. That speaks a lot to the leadership. Now, I mentioned to you before, I was honored to be present for a sort of friends and family tour that you had given on Fleet Week. And the ship was impressive, and the equipment was impressive, but was even more impressive were those sailors and Marines when you passed them. This wasn't sort of they weren't afraid, they weren't rigid. I had that clear impression, I would do anything for this man. That has nothing to do with your rank, brother. Nothing. Like you earned that. It was yours to lose, but it was also yours to gain in a deeper way, right? So I want to acknowledge, as I was reading the book, I recognized how that spoke to a leadership quality that I think is worth cultivating.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because we talk about as you progress and you transition, what are some of those really important things to you in your life? And obviously your legacy. What does that word mean? What do you truly want to leave behind, right? To those, and it's really interesting because what you find is that what you kind of viewed as your legacy was was it the accolades, was it the commands, all that kind of stuff, and you find that fades pretty quickly. That those are just sort of accomplishments. What you really realize is your legacy is, hey, who you trained, whether it's you want to say it's in the NFL they call it the coaching tree, whatever that is, how successful are those people that you led. And one of the things that I'm pretty proud of is I think I really taught them that, hey, you can lead from a position of empathy. You can lead from a position of vulnerability. You can lead from from your heart, where you engage with people and still hold them accountable and be successful. And I think that is one of those things that I think if I had a legacy to leave behind, is that you can do this and be successful.
And I think that leads us to one of the pre-questions I had asked you. What is the one idea that you want this healthcare leadership audience to take seriously? And you said to lead from the heart, engage with your team, and be vulnerable. And in my work, I talk about compassionate leadership, and it has these 4 essential aspects, right? Noticing suffering, interpreting in a way that's generous rather than punitive, and you talk about that directly in one of your lessons, right? About, hey, let me just take the perspective of this other person. Maybe there's something going on here. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, kind of thing. And then hold your felt response to that suffering without absorbing it, right? So you can be witness to someone else's suffering, but not take it on. And then take action in a way that reduces suffering. And here's the important thing: builds structural conditions under which others can flourish. So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you on this particular podcast is that as I read that book, your book, those 4 things kept coming up in my mind. I was watching those mechanics play out over and over and over again. So when you say lead from the heart, I feel like it is you are operationalizing the definition of compassionate leadership as the research has been playing out. So I just want to recognize that.
Yeah, and obviously on that discussion, I think I know exactly. I think it's like actually the very first chapter of the book where I talked about, we had this sailor, and what's how do you define the defiance versus confusion? Was the topic.
Yeah.
And very much we immediately assume, and maybe it's and all of that pressure that's going in our lives, and especially as we're managing it's a tendency that we will immediately assume the worst, or think that someone's not doing their best. And what I found more often than not is that people come to work and they really want to do a good job, right? Normally, the reason is not their desire. It's something structural. There's something in the process that's preventing them from being successful. And if you can take that time and actually engage with them and go a little bit deeper, be a little more empathetic, lead from the heart, you often will figure out, hey, it's a process.
Right. It's a systems issue.
It's a system issue. It's not a person issue. And you're fixing not only that for that one person, but you're then, bringing that back into this, overall, organization, and you're going to fix it for the next 3 or 4 down the road.
Yeah. And so you're building capacity.
Correct.
Right? So you're fixing systems, but you're also treating that person in a way that's very humane, very compassionate. And then they're going to be more capable of seeing system flaws and being a little less likely to shut down and cause problems. Because a lot of times what happens is they get overwhelmed. I think the sailor in the example was essentially overwhelmed because of this system's failure. By helping that sailor through, I sense that that sailor was now more equipped to recognize this problem is outside of me. Maybe I should do something different in response.
Correct. And then how do we improve the training program in the future to
Sure.
make it better for everyone? And
It's not like it was anything critical. I think it was nuclear operations.
So, which then brings me back at, but, there's that piece of it on the human level, but also as a manager, one of those, I think I had a great chapter on, hey, you also have a responsibility in accountability to the overall culture.
Sure.
Right. And I think I spoke very highly of that. I had a tremendous performer when I was on board USS Roosevelt, but he was just not a great fit for the culture that I was trying to build on board that ship.
Okay.
Very demeaning, to others, very much, never shared any of his common knowledge. People, had a hard time, interacting with them, all those kind of things. And, we had great conversations with them about, hey, some things you need to change this and that, and you need to really help, be better at these types of traits in your leadership. And clearly he wasn't getting there. And eventually, we had to move on because he was really impacting the culture. And that gets back into that whole entire, discussion is that, hey, people know who's impacting your culture. And they assume that you, as the leader, know it too. And if you're willing to put up with it, it says an awful lot about you as
it negates
you're not fixing those problems.
Right. It negates the culture. Right. Like we've all worked in places where the mission statement's very clearly emblazoned on every wall, and then yet somehow there's been this cultural erosion, and it negates the system. Because at the end of the day, it's always the culture is a system, just like nuclear operations, just like that physical system. The culture itself operates as a system within the organization. And as one of my favorite W. Edwards Deming quotes, a bad system will beat a good person every time. So if you're not able to help this sailor conform to the system, then they need to move to another system, which I think is what ended up happening in the book for that chapter, because I remember this in the book as well.
Yes, and in that chapter, the sailor moved on to a different command. And those things happen, and that is also part of that responsibility of sort of being that leader. Is that, hey, you owe it that you could end up having people who just simply will never fit into that system, right? And it's probably maybe it's just them, and it's not a negative about them. It's just that maybe that system doesn't work for them.
Maybe there's a fit somewhere else, right? It sounds to me like this particular guy needed to be the smartest person in the room, needed to make sure that all the knowledge was his, needed to make sure that he was irreplaceable. And you know what? Maybe there's a spot for that guy way down in a boiler room somewhere where he worked alone with a wrench. That's great. And I'm sure that you said it in the book. You were very clear. This person was a very high performer.
Yes. So, and we ask ourselves, what do we put up with from our really high performers that impacts the rest of the culture? And it's one of those things. It's something that you have to be very sensitive to.
If it breaks the system, again, that bad system is going to beat those good people every time.
And what's really interesting is when you see companies, especially companies that are in this growth process, and we talk about systems, they get to a point where they're just struggling, because what's happening is that they need to be transitioning from superhuman individuals to a great system, because you have to bring other people into that culture.
And you talk
that's
about
where companies so struggle, because they don't build those systems that are going to then be able to replicate going forward.
I see this. So in my world, I've done a fair amount of work in health tech and consulting, and I see this in that sort of startup to real company transition, where there's this move fast and break things CEO who had this great idea, and then the idea became a product, and the product became a business, and the business becomes an organization. And it is so hard because that CEO that got that company to that point is not the CEO that can move it forward unless he or she can literally transition into a different operating system, right? Because that's what we're talking about, right? What systems are you operating by?
Exactly. And there is something that's in this part of it, and then you're right. You're now in this where the system and the processes have to become the most important part and piece of that. And those people, in order to bring in other people to replicate, that great product and that company culture and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times, making that transition is just very hard for companies.
It's very. I've seen it happen. It's sad because then the CEO can't understand why the success is plateauing, why the business isn't moving, why the organization isn't flourishing, and a lot of it has to do with that. Just like you, if they were if they spent a little time on the bridge of the ship, they would realize that there's some skills that they could have used. They need the book. They need the book. That's, wait a minute. So the book is called The Loudest Sound is Silence. It's actually Principle 13, I think. It's the last one in the book, but you put it on the cover. I want to understand, why, I love the way it wraps, right? It's from the front of the book, but it's in the back of the book. But what was so important about that one principle?
So I think it really speaks to, hey, where are you on your openness? Where are you on the psychological safety of your organization? How forward leaning are the people who work for you in telling you, hey, here are the issues and problems that we need to deal with, right? And because at the end of the day, if people aren't coming forward, if people aren't speaking, it's not because your organization's great. It's because they don't feel safe to do it.
Yeah.
And that is really, and so, of course, I love the title because I think it's kind of catchy. People
it is kind of catchy.
A lot of sound and silence, so people read that and they're like, oh, well, let me see what this is about.
Right.
So it's from a catchy perspective, but it also was always reminding me that, hey, when people stop speaking, it's one, they either feel like it's not psychologically safe to do so, or number two, they're not going to be heard. That, hey, people don't care. Their concerns aren't going to be heard.
So it's almost like a tap the gauge moment, right? You're like, wait a minute.
It really is.
Yeah, it's like, wait, tick, tick, tick. Oh, no, that tachometer's not, that something's wrong, so I kind of felt like that when I read it.
And what I always people would always say, well, I got bad news to tell you. I'd be like, hey, it's not, there's no such thing.
So you got news to tell me.
You got news to tell me. You got something that I need to know, right? And that we're then going to figure out how to, work our way through it, and then either how to make it better, how to, how to turn it into an opportunity. But it's news. There's no, it's not
bad news. Is we hit the iceberg. News is, hey, there's an iceberg in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's really the essence of, the overall fundamental thing. I think all of those other things that we talk about throughout the book about being vulnerable and being accountable, admitting to your mistakes, and all those kind of things. Hold on to the plan loosely. All those things are all things that kind of lead to a crew that wants to come forward and to speak, and that feel vested in the outcome and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So my personal experience with you and your command was the Bataan, and that was a amphibious assault vessel. Am I correct?
Right. It's what we affectionately call the big deck for the MEU, Marine Amphibious Unit, Expeditionary Unit, but it's really the aircraft carrier for the Marine Expeditionary Unit.
I mean, you pulled up against the Intrepid. Like you and the Intrepid were berthed adjacent.
Correct.
And I was impressed with the fact that here was the Intrepid, the quintessential World War II aircraft carrier, that ship that my father described as a floating city, and the Bataan was bigger.
It was. It was from the World War II carriers, and we had all the Harriers, the Helos, the Ospreys, all the aircraft that the Marines carried,
plus all the amphibious equipment. You had these hovercrafts that were huge. Well, the size of the width of the ship that would go out and make amphibious landings. Like my father was a DUKW driver in the Korean era, so I this amphibious assault was always something that we talked about, and he would remember to me. But this ship was, as you described it, our job is to deliver Marines, put them in harm's way, get them back safely, and put them back together, or something like that, right? No one is ever going to accuse the captain of that ship of being soft, okay? And I think one of the things that keeps coming up is like, well, if I lead with compassion, if I lead with the heart, someone's going to accuse me of being soft. Could you help me understand a little bit about why that's a sort of a false equivalency?
So, it's kind of interesting because I often hear this topic come up, or it's kind of a discussion, and can you be compassionate but yet have high standards? Can you be compassionate but have high expectations of the people that work for you? Of course you can. I always tell everybody it's in some ways we make it really complex and complicated, but it really isn't, right? When you have your child, right? You care deeply about your child. You care about their success, right? But you still hold your child to high standards. You still hold your child accountable. You still discipline your child when they need to be disciplined, right? A lot of this is somewhat like how do you then take sort of that mindset and then impose it on a culture, right? How do you create that same sort of feeling across an entire culture of a ship? And that's really, to me, does that mean that, hey, there are times where you have to do things that make decisions that you don't want? Of course, there are times you make decisions for your family or for whatever that, hey, this is a really hard decision.
Sure.
And some of them aren't going to be happy. Hey, you know what? We're packing up and we're moving.
Well, happy is a different issue, right? So, I mean, somebody's always like, one of my favorite sayings is that you always know it is good negotiation because neither side is happy, but it's still fair. And I think one of the things that interests me a lot about when I was reading the book is I don't think you can be truly compassionate unless you have high standards. So if you take that sailor who was, truly overwhelmed, you had high standards for that sailor, especially given their capacity on the ship. There's something very uncomfortable about a nuclear accident on a floating vessel, right? So you had high standards, but you also provided that sailor with high support. So if you create sort of this matrix with standards going this way and support going this way, you are in that high support, high standards quadrant. And I think that's where compassion lives. Because it was compassionate to the sailor, he did want to do a good job. So it was compassionate to help him, A, realize this ain't it, and 2, these are the steps we're going to take to get you there. I feel like that is the essence of compassion. Would you agree?
I would. And then, as the leader of the organization, how do you then capture that experience and make sure that the solution to that is then put out across the culture or the organization?
Right. How do you scale it?
How do you take that, that one experience and say, okay, well, this is probably not the only place where we're struggling in this area. This is just it's the canary in the coal mine, or this should be, hey, we really need to take a look at, how are we engaging with our new sailors that come on board? Are we adapting our training to meet their, the way they see the world? Are they, they learn from reading? Do they learn from doing, and how are we, are we missing it, And I think that's the next step up on that whole entire thing and you get so much of that sort of knowledge from getting out there and engaging, directly, with the crew on a routine basis, because, you learn things that, as probably the leader of the organization, it may be an engineering issue, but is it applicable across all the departments? Is there something here that, hey, we're missing, command wide or organizational wide?
So you're not new to healthcare. The Bataan had a fully equipped hospital, surgical suite, intensive care. You had full trauma capacity, as you articulated to me. Get the Marines back, get them patched up, keep them safe. When you ran that whole operation, so like you were essentially not just the captain of the ship, you were responsible for hospital operations as well. What did you learn about leading clinicians in high-pressure operational environments that the broader healthcare industry could learn from?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things, so in a lot of ways, the way the healthcare industry and running a ship and all of that, a lot of it is there's a lot of similarities. And,
Yeah,
and I
sure.
say and but I do is that it is probably hours of mundane repeated items
and 1% of, oh no,
and then 30 seconds to 2 minutes of this high stress, high intensity, high issue. Now, I think there's a lot more going on in the healthcare industry in terms of resourcing and all those things that kind of play into it also,
sure,
that add to the stress level. But there is a lot of sort of that same sort of culture.
Wait, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to be clear. So when a Marine comes back from the battlefield, you're not pre-registering them, verifying their insurance, and getting a pre-auth?
Probably not.
Okay, wow, mind blown.
It's probably very similar to triage, right? If somebody walks into an emergency room and they're in a heart attack or flatlining, right? You're going to resuscitate them. Then you may actually.
You're going to get their insurance card.
Yeah, but we do very routine. A lot of the processes and steps are the same, right? And so under those high pressure situations, though, there's always going to be that one little thing that's different. What's unique about today, right? And that in getting that unique thing up and out. Hey, you know what? This piece of gear is this monitor isn't working.
Okay.
So how are we going to mitigate that? Or we don't have this size needle, or all those kind of things that are part of sort of the daily day. How do we communicate it? How do we mitigate it? And how do we provide the best care to our patients?
So there's a process there, right? First, identify, assess, mitigate.
Right. But that all happens inside an environment of communication, right? People feel comfortable saying that, holy cow, I forgot to reorder size X syringes and now we don't have them. You don't want to find out when you're going to put the chest tube in, right? You want to find out beforehand that, hey, we don't have that and this is how we're going to compensate for it today.
Fantastic. I really like, I don't remember which principle it was, but leave the cabin. I was talking to a friend of mine who was an executive in healthcare, and he said the CEO, there was a waterfront hospital. The hospital just happened to be on the water. You might even know where it is. He said the CEO of the hospital spends his entire day in his boat docked at the seawall of the hospital. I can't think of any further away from leave the cabin than that. I can't express, at least in the leadership roles I've held, the value of walking around and how when I've not been in leadership roles, it means to know that the person in charge is doing that. Can you explain why I feel that way?
Yeah, so I think it's just, there is some part of your ability to, one, understand, as a leader, I always tell everybody, you got really two hands. You got one hand's in the day-to-day operations and one hand's in the strategic side of that, the long-term planning. And you really need to understand what's going on in that day-to-day. And for myself personally, that meant that, I walked, for the first half hour, after I kind of got myself settled into the day, the first half hour, 45 minutes, I'd walk from, the bow, the front end of the ship, to the stern, the back end of the ship. I'd walk from the bridge, which is the highest part of the ship, to the engineering.
That's a lot of ship. That's a lot of ship.
I would do it in an hour, and I'd move pretty quick. But I would look around, and I would see almost all the major departments. I would see all the people, and I could tell the mood of the ship. I could tell where they were going. I could tell if they were tired, if they were frustrated. People would come up to me and say, hey, we're having this issue, or, oh, by the way, we're about to run out of toilet paper. You'd be surprised at things that people would tell you.
Toilet paper is important for those of us who have lived through the pandemic when maybe we weren't going to have any.
Most definitely, we're down to our last box or whatever. The things that came out, things that I would never, there was no dashboard in the world that's going to provide you that. And I think a lot of times we feel that, we almost get comfortable enough, and maybe AI's even trying to make us more comfortable that, hey, we can get you that information at the touch of the finger, and you don't need to. At the end of the day, you don't
need to have a human connection. I think
have a human connection, and you need to be on the deck plate, and you need to talk to people, and you need to understand what's going on, and even more so if you're about to make a big decision, right? Who are the 4 or 5 people that you trust that you say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Or what am I missing? Or I always used to say, what are the second and third order effects that I'm not thinking about right now? What's going to happen, to try to save you a little bit of that pain before you put it out there. And a lot of times on that walkabout, when I'd see the supply officer or the logistics folks and say, hey, what do you think?
The power of casual conversation.
Yes,
right? They're disarmed. They're and they're ready to talk, which is great, because I know that in my experience in healthcare, I learned more about the human being behind the care that I was delivering when I did home care. I was out of my context, and I was in their context, and it made all the difference in the world. I felt my care was more complete, this is kind of what I'm hearing. It's kind of like your version of home care. You're going into their world. It also speaks to your intent, right? So I always feel like a big aspect of the architecture of trust is, what is the intent of the person that is trying to get my trust? Do they care? Because if they don't care, I'm going to have a little bit more trouble trusting them, right? So when I look at trust, I always imagine there's competency, either earned or unearned. So in your case, you walk in as the captain. That's essentially an unearned trust, because they're trusting the rank, and then you earn it. Good. And then there's your character, which I've seen your character. It's awesome. And then your intent. Like, what is this person's intent? And if their intent is, I can't wait to get to my next grade, my next bump, whatever. I'm shooting for admiral, so you guys better make me look good. It's a much different intent than, hey, how you doing today? Do you need toilet paper?
Definitely. Or, hey, what's going on at home? Or, hey, and the problem is, you got to really be there, though. You got to be authentic. And that was probably,
because people will sniff out when you're not authentic in a second, and then your intent piece of the trust architecture is going to start to collapse the whole structure. So you got to be authentic.
So the joy of the book, or maybe the takeaway from the book, is, hey, you know what? You can be successful, and you can be like this.
It's very accessible.
It's very accessible, that you can, find your success in life, in your career, by leading like this. And that is probably one of the biggest takeaways, is that, you shouldn't be fearful of, being vulnerable and putting yourself out there.
So the book is The Loudest Sound is Silence, and I'm here with Captain John Carter, the author, and the book is, in fact, very accessible, very readable, and I really like the way it was put together, because I felt like I really learned something. And I read a lot of business books, and a lot of times I have to read them 2 or 3 times to try to parse out what's the lesson. That's not this book. This book is clear, to the point, and you will walk away on one reading with some valuable, actionable lessons. So I want to thank John for his time, and I wish you the best of luck with the book and anything you do moving forward.
Well, thank you very much, Russ. And as always, it's always a pleasure catching up with you and having the opportunity to spend just a few moments talking about things that I'm very passionate about. So,
me too. Thank you. All right.